and needed lots of participation this morning. So Articles of Confederation was the very first Constitution of the United States of America, the very first Constitution, and it set up how strong was the national government? How strong was the national government under the Articles, Alyssa?
Was it very weak?
Yeah, very, very weak national government compared to strong state government. So weak national government compared to strong state governments. And then I would put like two columns. What were some strengths and weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? What were some strengths of the Articles of Confederation? What did they do well? Yeah, Alyssa.
They prevented tyranny.
Right. They prevented tyranny. So one strength is it really gave people what they wanted. It prevented tyranny. So one strength is it really gave people what they wanted. It prevented tyranny. It prevented, what they had under King George III. What was the other big strength of the Articles of Confederation? The other big strength, reading.
Handled Western settlement really well.
Right, it handled Western settlement really well. So another big advantage is it handled Western settlement very well, effectively settled the lands in the Northwest. So it very effectively settled the lands in the Northwest, handled the whole Western settlement thing very, very well. All right, what were the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? What were the negatives, the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? The national government was extremely weak, and what are some examples of that, or what are some examples of how the government just did not have the capacity to solve the problems of the country? Weaknesses of the Articles. Yeah, go ahead, Gina. No power to tax. So one big weakness was no power to tax. Another weakness, no power to tax. What was another weakness? No power to, Abby.
Can you not regulate the trade?
Exactly, no power to regulate interstate or overseas trade. So no power to regulate interstate or overseas trade. No power to regulate interstate or overseas trade. So states could tax things coming in from other states. Another weakness of the Articles. There was no what? What did not exist? What branches did not exist under the Articles of Confederation? What branches did not exist? Yeah, Jack.
No legislative, judicial, or executive branch.
You had a legislative, but no executive or judicial branch. So there's no executive or judicial branch under the Articles. No executive or judicial branch. And in order to get an amendment passed to actually change the Articles, what do you need? To get an amendment passed to change the Articles, what was needed? Yeah, Regan. Yeah, unanimous. You needed all 13 states, a unanimous decision in order to make an amendment to change the Articles. You needed all 13 states. Any questions on that? The Ordinance of 1785, number 29. What did the Ordinance of 1785 do? What did the Ordinance of 1785, number 29, do? Just like give me the general idea. What was the Ordinance of 1785 about? Yeah, Hannah.
Is that the act that split the land up into mile by mile sections and divide the
Exactly. The purpose of the act was to survey the land and divide it up in order to be sold at auction. To survey the land and divide it up in order to be sold at auction. And then the money would be used to pay off the Revolutionary War debt. So to survey the land, divide it up in order to sell at auction, in order to sell the land at auction, and then that money would be used to pay off the national debt. And they divided it up how, Hannah? You were describing how they divided the land up?
I think it was in 6x6 mile sections, and then that was put into 1x1.
Yeah.
Or like 1/16 went to education.
Exactly. So they split it up into 36 square mile townships, and then that was subdivided into 36 square mile plots that were sold at auction. So they had these 36 square mile townships that were again subdivided into 36 separate square mile plots that were sold at auction. And then, like Hannah said, the income from one of the 36 plots would go for education. The income from selling one of the 36 would go for education. 36 square mile townships subdivided into square mile sections. What was the purpose, number 30, of the Northwest Ordinance? What was the purpose of the Northwest Ordinance, number 30? Purpose of the Northwest Ordinance. Yeah, go ahead, Gina.
Wasn't this set up a process for the territories to become states?
Right, this is the one that set a process for territories to become states. So the Northwest Ordinance set up a process for territories to become states, set up a government for the Northwest Territory, and a process for territories to become states. And what was banned in the Northwest Territory, notably, what was banned in the Northwest Territory? What was prohibited, what was banned? Yeah, Abby?
Slavery.
Slavery was banned in the Northwest Territory. And then what was guaranteed to the residents of the Northwest Territory? What was guaranteed to the residents of the Northwest Territory? A Bill of Rights was guaranteed. A Bill of Rights was guaranteed to the residents. So set up a process for territories to become states is a big part. So you just want to keep those straight for the final this week, that the Ordinance of 1785, number 29, that's the one that divided the land up, surveyed it to sell it at auction, and then the Northwest Ordinance is the one that kind of set up the process for territories to become states. Any questions on that? Number 31, Shays' Rebellion, 1786. Shays' Rebellion, 1786. Who rebelled in Shays' Rebellion, and why were they rebelling? This happened in Western Massachusetts. Who rebelled, and why were they rebelling in Shays' Rebellion? Yeah, go ahead, Haley.
Farmers, and because they were in debt.
Right, they were farmers in Western Massachusetts, and they were in debt. So they were rebelling because their property was being foreclosed because they couldn't pay their debts off, so they were losing their farms. Their property was being auctioned off. Some were thrown in debtor's prison. So because they couldn't pay their debts and taxes, farmers were having trouble paying their debts and taxes. They were losing their farms. Their property was being auctioned off. They were being thrown in debtor's prison. So losing their farms, property was being auctioned off, they were being thrown in debtor's prison. So they rebelled. You may remember they shut down some courts in Western Massachusetts. They actually shut down some court proceedings to stop the auctions from happening. How did the national government deal with Shays' Rebellion? Or what was the reaction of the national government to Shays' Rebellion? Do you remember that? Reaction of the national government to Shays' Rebellion. Yep, go ahead. Right, they couldn't put it down. They tried, the national government tried but failed to put the rebellion down. So the national government tried but failed to put the rebellion down. They tried to raise troops to put the rebellion down, but then no one committed troops. So they tried but failed to put the rebellion down. And yes, go ahead.
So they just didn't realize they had to change the Articles of Confederation.
Right, and the significance of it is it led to a need to change the Articles of Confederation. But they tried but failed to put the rebellion down, and then a group of wealthy Massachusetts citizens had to put it down. And the significance is it showed the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. It really led to cause for revising the Articles of Confederation, so it showed the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. and it led to calls for trying to revise the Articles of Confederation and write a whole new constitution. So it showed the weakness of the Articles of Confederation that led to calls to try to revise it and write a whole new constitution. People realized that the national government needed strengthening. Any questions on number 31? The big point is it showed the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. That's like the big significance. Number 32, the Philadelphia Convention, 1787. What was the original purpose of the Philadelphia Convention? Go ahead, Brooke.
Is it to fix the Articles of Confederation?
Right. The original purpose was to revise the Articles of Confederation, but what did they end up doing? The original purpose was to revise the Articles of Confederation, but what did they end up doing? Becca?
They ended up writing a whole new one.
Excellent. They ended up writing a whole new constitution. So they were going to revise the Articles of Confederation, but they ended up writing a whole new constitution which made the national government much stronger. So they were going to revise the Articles of Confederation, but they ended up writing a whole new constitution which greatly strengthened the national government. That is it for that page. Any questions? Could you move on to the next page then, please? Number 33, the Great Compromise or Connecticut Compromise. The Great Compromise or Connecticut Compromise was the major compromise at the Constitutional Convention. If it had not been for this compromise, the Constitution would not have been written. What was this compromise about, or what did the compromise set up? Yeah, Becca.
Was it for like the states who didn't want to accept the articles that they would guarantee a Bill of Rights in the Constitution?
No. It wasn't about promising a Bill of Rights, although they did promise a Bill of Rights to get some, but that was after the Constitutional Convention during the ratification process. This is the one that, Hannah?
So they agreed to set up both the Senate and the House.
Right, this is the one that set up two houses, a Senate and a House, in order to solve the dispute between the big states and the small states. So it set up the Senate and House to solve the dispute between the big states and small states. In the Senate, each state would get equal representation, and in the House, the amount of representatives would be based on population. So the big states wanted it based on population, the small states said it should be equal, so the House of Representatives was based on population to make the big states happy, and in the Senate, each state would get an equal number of senators to make the smaller states happy. So set up the House and the Senate. House is based on population. In the Senate, each state would have equal numbers of senators. I'd like you to make, for number 34 then, I'd like you to make two columns, Federalists and Republicans, for the two parties that formed in the 1790s. And can you give me one major difference between the Federalists and the Republican Party? Let's start out here, I'll give you some hints. Let's start out with leaders. Who is the leader of the Federalist Party? Who are the leaders of the Democratic Republicans in the 1790s? Who's the leader of the Federalist Party in the 1790s? Yeah, go ahead, Abby.
Alexander Hamilton.
Excellent, yes. Alexander Hamilton. So Alexander Hamilton was the leader of the Federalist Party. Who are the leaders of the Democratic Republican Party? The two leaders. Both will become president someday, if that helps. The two Democratic Republican leaders. Becca. Oh, I thought you had your hand up. I'm sorry. Never mind.
I can do it.
Okay.
Is it George Washington and like John Adams?
Nope. They're actually federal. They're all actually considered Federalists. Yeah, Hannah.
Was it Jefferson and James?
Right. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. So the two Democratic Republican leaders were Jefferson and Madison. Another big difference is, of course, that the Federalists were for Hamilton's bank and debt plans, and the Democratic Republicans were against it. That's pretty easy. So the Federalists were for Hamilton's debt and bank plans, and the Democratic Republicans were against them. Which was the pro-British party and which was the pro-French party during the battle between Great Britain and France? Which was the pro-British party? What was the pro-French party? Yeah, Ted.
The Democratic Republicans were for the French.
Yes, excellent. And the Federalists were for the British. So the Federalists were the pro-British party, and the Democratic Republicans were the pro-French party. So Federalists pro-British, Democratic Republicans pro-French. Hope you guys are staying awake if you're watching this on YouTube. So Federalists were pro-British, Democratic Republicans were pro-French. What was the interpretation of the Constitution? How did they differ over constitutional interpretation? How did they differ over the constitutional interpretation? Jack?
Federalists were loose interpretation, Republicans were strict interpretation.
Exactly. Federalists were for loose interpretation. Democratic Republicans were for strict interpretation. So the Federalists were for loose interpretation. Democratic Republicans were for strict interpretation and more rights to the states. And where were they based? What was the base of strength of each party? Each party was based, Federalists were based in what part of the country, and the Democratic Republicans were based in what part of the country? Who wants to try that one? Where were the Federalists based? Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
New England.
Yep, the Federalists were based in the Northeast, in New England especially, but the Federalists had their base of strength in the Northeast and New England especially, and then the Democratic Republicans were based in the South and the West. Democratic Republicans were based in the South and West. Number 35, Jay's Treaty. The U.S. signed Jay's Treaty with what other country? The U.S. signed Jay's Treaty with what other country? This is a treaty between the United States and whom? Ted?
France.
Nope, Great Britain. So it's a treaty, good guess though, but a treaty between the United States and Great Britain. What major thing did Jay's Treaty do for the United States? Finally, after 13 agonizing years, what did this treaty do for the U.S., Abby?
They removed troops from the soil.
Right. British troops agreed to remove from U.S. soil. So, in this treaty, British troops agreed to remove from U.S. soil finally. But this treaty was seen as a pro-British treaty because it gave in to Great Britain in so many ways, so it was seen as a pro-British treaty. What are some problems that it didn't solve? This treaty did nothing about what? A couple of things, yeah, Nick?
Impressment.
It did nothing about impressment, and so this treaty was seen as pro-British because it did nothing about impressment, and it did nothing about what else were the British doing that were making us mad? It did nothing about impressment, and it did nothing about... Yeah, Abby?
Weren't they like seizing our trading ships with like someone?
Right, it did nothing about impressment and did nothing about seizure of American ships by Great Britain. Great Britain was seizing our ships, trading in the French West Indies, so it did nothing about Great Britain seizing our ships that were trading with France. So it did nothing about impressment and did nothing about British seizing American ships trading with France. The Whiskey Rebellion, number 36, happened in western Pennsylvania. Why were whiskey farmers in western Pennsylvania rebelling? Why were whiskey farmers in western Pennsylvania rebelling? Why were they rebelling? Yeah, go ahead, Brooke. Yep, they were rebelling because of the tax on whiskey. And why was this tax on whiskey so upsetting to farmers in western Pennsylvania? What is it about the whiskey tax, which is part of Hamilton's death plan, that was so upsetting to farmers in western Pennsylvania? Yeah, Gina.
Did they use it as currency all the time?
It was their main way of profit. Whiskey was their main way of profit because crops were way too bulky and expensive to transport across the mountains. It was much easier to distill crops than whiskey. So whiskey was their main source of profit. And this cut into it. Also, do you remember, if they had to go to federal court, why was that a hassle for them? If they had to go to federal court for violating the whiskey tax, not paying the whiskey tax, why was that a big hassle for farmers in western Pennsylvania? Yeah, Ted.
They travel long distances to like Eastern Pennsylvania.
Yep, they had to go all the way to Philadelphia, which was a very long trip. So it was very expensive. It was an expensive long trip to go to court in Philadelphia. If you were in the Pittsburgh area breaking the whiskey tax, it was a long, expensive trip to go to court. So, typical rebellion, typical brouhaha, right? They end up destroying a bunch of property, burning down houses, a tax collector, burn down a house of a tax collector, just a whole, they wreak havoc or whatever. What was President Washington's response to the Whiskey Rebellion? What was President Washington's response to the Whiskey Rebellion? Yeah, go ahead, Becca.
Didn't he just like completely attack him?
Yeah, he raised an army of some 13,000 troops to put down the rebellion. So he raised an army of some 13,000 troops to put down the rebellion. And what was the significance of that? So Washington raises an army of 13,000 militiamen to put down the rebellion, and that's significant because, Lydia? Yeah, two reasons it was significant. One, it showed the power of the new federal government. It showed that under the new Constitution, the U.S. government had much more power, but it was seen as an overreaction. It was seen as tyrannical to raise a 13,000-man army to crush a few poor whiskey farmers. That was seen as tyrannical. So yes, it showed new respect for the federal government, but it was seen as an overreaction. And then number 37, Pinckney's Treaty was between the U.S. and what country? Alyssa.
Spain.
And what major thing did the U.S. get out of Pinckney's Treaty? It was between the U.S. and Spain, and the major thing the U.S. got was? Yeah, go ahead, Abby.
Florida?
No, that's Adams-Otis Treaty. That's not until after the War of 1812. Hannah? Free and unrestricted use of the Mississippi. So Pinckney's Treaty gave the U.S. free and unrestricted use of the Mississippi River. Free and unrestricted use of the Mississippi River. Number 38, the XYZ affair. Under President Adams, what happened in the XYZ affair? If you had to give me like a one-sentence summary, what happened in the XYZ affair? Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
France wanted us to bribe them in order to negotiate.
Right. The French were seizing American ships in the Caribbean. We wanted to negotiate with them, and the French basically said they would not even talk with the Americans unless the Americans paid a whole bunch of money to France. So the French, we wanted to talk with France about France seizing our ships in the Caribbean, and the French basically said, we won't even talk with you unless we get a bunch of money. I think it was $250,000 in cash and a $12 million loan. So the French foreign minister sent these agents, XYZ, who basically said, we won't even talk with you unless we get $250,000 and a $12 million loan. Americans rejected the bribe. So Americans, basically the American negotiators said, no way, we're not going to pay. We reject the bribe. What is the significance of the XYZ affair? What did it lead to in the United States? That France tried to bribe us. France basically said, we're not going to talk with you unless we get lots and lots and lots and lots of money. That led to what happening in America? There were calls for what happening in America. There was calls for... Yeah, go ahead, Abby. War with France, right. But we didn't... So it led to this big military buildup. It led to calls for war with France and this big military buildup. And then the quasi-war, second part of number 38, the quasi-war was an unofficial war in the Caribbean that the U.S. won over France. So it led to calls for war with France, and then the quasi-war was an unofficial war between the U.S. and the French in the Caribbean that the U.S. won. You guys are doing great here. I know this is a lot of info. Really appreciate your dedication for being here this morning. It's awesome. that you took the time to do that. Could you go to the next page, please? So, the Alien and Sedition Act. First of all, what was the general the supposed purpose of these acts? The supposed purpose of the Alien and Sedition Act. Supposed purpose was because these were needed for national security. So the purpose was that if there was war with France, we wanted to make sure that people in America didn't side with France. So these were supposedly needed for national security. What party came up with the Alien and Sedition Act? Which of the two political parties came up with them, passed them through Congress? Abby?
Federalist?
Yep, the Federalist Party passed them. And the supposed purpose, again, was to make sure that if there was war with France, Americans took the side of America and not France. But what did the Federalist Party use these acts to do? What did the Federalist Party use these acts to do? Go ahead, Abby.
Strengthen their power, because a lot of the immigrants are becoming Republicans.
Right, they actually use these acts to attack the Democratic Republican Party and weaken the Democratic Republican Party. So they use these acts to attack and weaken the Democratic Republican Party. You may remember they put Democratic Republican editors in jail, etc. So the Federalists use these to go after the Democratic Republicans. And then let's just write down what the Sedition Act was. We won't go through the three Alien Acts because of our time constraints. But what did the Sedition Act say again? And this is the one that they really used against the Democratic Republican Party, the Sedition Act. It basically said you could not do what? You could not write or speak what in public? According to the Sedition Act. Nick?
You couldn't speak negative about the government.
Right, you couldn't really say anything bad about the government or its officers. So you couldn't say anything bad about the government or its officers. And it was used by the Federalists to go after the Democratic Republicans. Any questions on that? All right, Marbury versus Madison, 1803. This was the first Supreme Court case that what? Marbury versus Madison was the very first Supreme Court case that it's famous because it established what principle, or it was the first time that this happened. It's the first time the Supreme Court did what? Marbury versus Madison, the first time the Supreme Court? No idea? Yeah, Abby?
Did it say that the bank is constitutional?
First time the Supreme Court declared a law of Congress unconstitutional. So Marbury versus Madison is the first time that the Supreme Court declared a law of Congress unconstitutional. First time that the Supreme Court declared a law of Congress unconstitutional. What is that principle known as? The principle of the Supreme Court declaring a law of Congress unconstitutional is known as? Go ahead, Nick. Judicial review. This established judicial review, the power of the Supreme Court to declare a law of Congress unconstitutional. Before France sold us Louisiana, number 41, what was Jefferson interested in purchasing? What was Jefferson interested in purchasing, Jack?
Just New Orleans.
Right, we wanted to buy New Orleans. We really wanted that port. If France controlled it, that was not good for the U.S., so the U.S. wanted to buy New Orleans. And France, Napoleon, ended up selling us all of Louisiana for $15 million. So France ended up selling us all of Louisiana for $15 million. Why did Napoleon sell this huge piece of land, Becca?
Okay, I actually know this one. It was
Good.
because he lost the territory in the Caribbean, and that territory was going to be used for foodstuffs.
Right, right. He gave up on his dream of the Caribbean Empire. The Louisiana was going to provide foodstuffs for the Caribbean Empire, and one reason Napoleon sold this land is he gave up on his dream of a Caribbean Empire. Another reason was, yeah, go ahead, Brooke.
Wasn't he in another war in the 20s? Or maybe he wasn't in one.
He wanted money for his war in Europe. Another reason is he wanted money for his war in Europe. So he wanted money for his war in Europe. what problem did Jefferson have with the Louisiana Purchase? Jefferson was uneasy about the Louisiana Purchase, and therefore what did he do? Brooke?
He thought it was unconstitutional.
So he proposed? Okay, he proposed. He thought it was unconstitutional, so what did he propose? Go ahead. Alyssa? Right, he proposed an amendment, but then he dropped the amendment when Napoleon was going to change his mind. So Jefferson thought it was unconstitutional. He proposed an amendment to make it constitutional, but ended up dropping the amendment idea when it looked like Napoleon was going to change his mind. So we bought Louisiana for $15 million at double the size of the U.S. What did number 42? The other big thing under Jefferson was the Embargo Act. What did the Embargo Act do? What did the Embargo Act do exactly? What did the Embargo Act do? Yeah, go ahead, Becca.
Did it try to stop trade with Britain?
In all countries. The U.S. stopped exports to all countries. So the U.S. would stop exports to all countries. Basically said we would not export. It was illegal for the U.S. or any American to export anything to a foreign country. And Jefferson's strategy, both Great Britain and France were seizing American ships, and that was a problem. Jefferson's strategy is known as peaceable coercion. What was peaceable coercion? Explain that for me. We'll explain Jefferson's strategy of peaceable coercion. What was that? Peaceable coercion. Yeah, Abby.
That like he thought if he could like stop giving trade to like other countries, that they would stop using their ships because like they needed them and depended on them.
Yeah, he thought that he could peacefully force Great Britain and France to respect U.S. neutrality. That was the idea. That Jefferson believed peaceable coercion. He could peacefully force Great Britain and France to respect American neutrality because they needed our foodstuffs so badly. He thought that by banning trade, they'd respect us then, so that we could peacefully force Great Britain and France to respect U.S. neutrality. Peacefully force Great Britain and France to respect U.S. neutrality. Why did the Embargo Act not work? Why was it a failure? Yeah, go ahead, Lydia. Yeah, Great Britain and France found other places to get what they needed, so Great Britain and France found other places to get what they needed. It also didn't work because Great Britain and France found other places to get what they needed. Abby?
Because people were smuggling around it.
Right, because people were smuggling their way around it. So it also didn't work because people were smuggling their way around the law. And then it hurt the American economy more than it hurt Great Britain or France. It actually hurt the American economy. New England was devastated with all its shipping and trade was cut. So New England was devastated. The South and West couldn't export crops. South and West were devastated. It hurt America more than it hurt Great Britain and France. So it didn't work. Behind this wall is our school store Blue Vibes, and that's remember how we remember the 5 major causes of the War of 1812 with the acronym VIBES, V-I-B-E-S. What did V stand for in VIBES? V stood for, Becca.
Violation of American neutrality.
Excellent. Violation of American neutrality. So we go to war with Great Britain because V, violation of American neutrality. What did the I stand for? Go ahead.
Impressment?
Impressment, right. Violation of American neutrality. Impressment. What did the B in VIBE stand for? Becca.
It was either British incitement or British seizure of our ships.
British incitement of Indians. The B is British incitement of Indians. So violation of American neutrality. Impressment, British incitement of Indians. The E stood for economic recession. Who can finish it for me? Economic recession in the, Alyssa?
I might get this wrong.
South and West. So economic recession. Economic recession in the South. South and West. And then the S stood for ships of Great Britain. Who can finish it? Ships of Great Britain in? Becca.
American waters.
American waters. Ships of Great Britain in American waters. So you should have V, violation of American neutrality. I, impressment. B, British incitement of Indians. E, economic recession in the South and West. And S, ships of Great Britain in American waters. And then the bigger reason we wanted to go to war was we needed to prove that our form of government could work. We needed to prove to the world that the Republican form of government could work. That this experiment in Republican government could work. We needed to prove that. All right, let's go to the Hartford Convention, number 44. Who met at the Hartford Convention during the War of 1812? Who met at the Hartford Convention? Who met and why? Like, well, this is a meeting of what group of people and why at the Hartford Convention? Yeah, Justin.
The Federalists over their problems with the war and the Democratic Republicans.
Exactly. The Federalists met because they were mad about the war and how the Democratic Republicans seemed to be controlling the country. So the Federalists met at the Hartford Convention because they were mad about the war of 1812. They didn't like it, and then they were mad about how the Democratic Republicans seemed to be taking over the country. What did the Hartford Convention mean for the Federalist Party and why? What did it mean for the Federalist Party and why did it mean that? Becca?
It was the end of the Federalist Party because they were seen as like just really negative and not like nationalist.
Exactly. It was the end of the Federalist Party. Their demands seemed unpatriotic. They even seemed treasonous because some of them wanted to break away from the Union. But it meant the end of their party. They came up with their demands, remember, at the same time that the War of 1812 was ending. So as people were celebrating the end of the War of 1812 and the victory at New Orleans, here you had these Federalists who had all these demands, and they seemed to be complaining, they seemed to be whiners, they seemed to be unpatriotic. It led to the end of the Federalist Party. What were the three parts of Henry Clay's, number 45, what were the three parts of Henry Clay's, you guys are doing great here, Henry Clay's American system. What were the three parts of Henry Clay's American system? Brooke?
Isn't there an acronym just like
Yep, there is. 10. Do you know what the parts stand for?
T is tariff, isn't it?
Tariff, right? T is tariff. I is... Anyone? So T is tariff. I is, Lydia? Internal improvements. And N is... Becca?
National Bank.
National Bank. So 10. Tariff, internal improvements, and National Bank. American system. Tariff, internal improvement, National Bank. And what was the purpose of the American system? Why did Henry Clay want these things? Tariff, internal improvement, National Bank. Jack?
To make the U.S. self-sufficient.
Right. He wanted to make America self-sufficient so they wouldn't rely on Europe. He wanted to tie the different parts of the economy together. So tie the different parts of the country together economically. Make America self-sufficient. And he wanted to promote the formation of what? That America really didn't have yet. He wanted the formation of what in New England in the Northeast? Henry Clay wanted the formation of what in New England in the Northeast? Yeah, Abby?
Factory.
Industry, right, industrialization. So he's trying to promote industrialization in factories in the Northeast and in the Northeast and New England. Promote industrialization. Number 46, when Missouri petitioned to enter the Union as a slave state, why was that a problem? When Missouri petitioned to enter the Union as a slave state, why was that a problem, Melissa?
Wouldn't it like upset the balance between the free and slave states?
Right, it would upset the balance between free and slave states. So when Missouri petitioned to enter the Union as a slave state, the fear was it would upset the balance between slave and free states. So what did the Missouri Compromise do to resolve that dilemma? Becca?
It let Maine enter the free state.
Yep, so Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state, Missouri Compromise. Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state. Maine would enter the Union as a free state. And then what was the third most pivotal part of the compromise? Sarah?
The 3630 line?
The 3630 line. So it said that there be no slavery north of 3630 in the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase. So no slavery north of the 3630 line, or slavery would be prohibited north of the 3630 line in the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase. Any questions on that? And then the Monroe Doctrine. This was aimed at Europe. What were the two major things that the Monroe Doctrine said? The two major things that the U.S. told Europe in the Monroe Doctrine. What was one of them? It's a U.S. foreign policy statement telling Europe to, Brooke?
That we were neutral in foreign affairs and we didn't want to be involved in foreign wars.
Well, we didn't want to get, we pledged that we would not get involved in European wars. We did do that, but I'm looking for something bigger. Alyssa?
Wasn't it like the non-intervention and colonization?
Exactly. The two things are non-intervention, non-colonization. The Monroe Doctrine told the countries of Europe, non-intervention, don't intervene in the Western Hemisphere. We don't want you to intervene in the Western Hemisphere. Don't get involved in the conflicts over here. So non-intervention. Told European countries to not intervene in the Western Hemisphere. And then non-colonization. No new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Told Europe, no new colonies in the Western Hemisphere.